Hello, everybody.
Thank
Good
you.
evening. It's nice to be speaking to you from the other side of the country, sort of. Manchester, sort of halfway, I suppose, halfway down. And it's pleasing actually that we have some guests, people who want to come and see me. And I do know you, Charles, from Facebook, of course. Seen your pictures and admired them, and I can see why you want to see a macro talk, because you do macro yourself, don't you? So yeah, so thanks again for inviting me. We are going to be looking at macro photography tonight, which is my main passion in photography, although I do other things like landscapes. And it's going to be mainly a talk about how I do my macro photography, obviously illustrated with lots of my best images. You will see a lot of butterflies, so I hope you don't get butterflied out by the end of the evening. I mean, those are the ones that seem to do the best in the salons and competitions for some reason. I guess because they're just beautiful creatures, aren't they? But I do other things too, as you will see. So it's going to be a sort of guide, as I said. What I've done is divided the talk into 7 challenges. I do think macro is quite a challenging genre of photography. At least the sort that I'm going to be talking about tonight, which is going out into nature, into the field, into meadows, fields, parks, etc., and trying to photograph creatures that actually live there, that are alive. I mean, you know, there are many challenging types of photography. They all have their difficulties, and being good at any form of art is very difficult, I think. But there's something about macro, it has these extra sort of levels of challenges, and so that's why I thought it would be suitable to talk about that tonight and how I try to overcome those challenges. So the first thing I want to say really is that it is my guide, my approach, not the approach. You may have your own way of doing things, and you may prefer that. You may disagree with some of what I say, some of what I do. You know, frequently get people saying, well, I wouldn't do that. That's fine, absolutely fine. Yes, whatever works for you, really. So, you know, some of this you may find interesting and useful, some of it you may disagree with, but hopefully at least you'll enjoy the pictures. Fingers crossed. So let's get started with some screen sharing. So now I'm hoping you can all see that. The talk is called The Art of Macro, and that's also the name of the website, which has lots of my other pictures on. And we were talking about the salons. I just recently got my BPE 4. Not got the actual certificate yet, but I've got the points. And I also in January got my DPAGB, which is one of the awards the PAGB gives out. If you haven't heard of it, there's different levels. That's the second level. The first level is C, then D, then M. And you will see, in fact, my DPAGB was a set of 15 pictures, and 12 of those were macro shots. And so you'll see possibly all of those tonight. And as I said before, I'll mention, in case you're interested, which of the pictures have won the major awards, like the gold medal, silver medals, that sort of thing. The title of this I chose after a while, after a lot of thinking, really, because I realized that my approach is sort of more towards the art side of things than the nature or natural history, you know, recording what's out there sort of approach. And you know, that's going to be one of the main themes tonight. I think you'll see, hopefully, in the sense that what I'm trying to create is something that's attractive to look at, something that gives you that sort of special glow you get when you look at nature, whether that's animals of whatever size or type, or, you know, the beauty of a nice landscape. All these sorts of things give us some special sort of feeling, don't they? At least they do me. And when you get the picture just right, it sort of raises that feeling to a higher level, and that's what I'm trying to reach. And I have a certain style and approach, although not only one style, and I'm trying to vary that, which I'll talk about as well. And how I achieve that, all of this is what the talk's really going to be about, you know, how I get things like a sharp, you know, in this case, what you see here, 2 sharp male banded demoiselles. So yeah, so that's why I called it The Art of Macro. And I've had a lifelong interest in art and nature. Both of those are very strong interests of mine since I was a child, and they sort of come together, I think, very nicely for me. They're nicely sort of combined in my macro photography. I'm going to give you a brief introduction first before we get onto the main part of the talk, the challenges. So before I got seriously into photography, I was sort of dabbling in it. I enjoyed it, but didn't really know what I was doing. Had a point and shoot camera. Then in 2016, decided to dive in a bit more seriously and got my first DSLR, which was a Nikon D5200, which I got off eBay. Most of my stuff comes from eBay, in fact, to be honest. And I also later that year in the summer joined my own local club, South Manchester Camera Club. And getting that camera and joining the club really opened my eyes to the possibilities of photography. And I realized how little I knew and how much better photography could be than what I had been doing, both in terms of image quality, obviously, but also in terms of just the artistic side of things, how to compose a good picture, getting good light, all of these sorts of things. I had really been doing lots of nature and landscape photography anyway, plus a lot of historical sites and artifacts, because of what I do during the day is workshops in primary schools, and some of that is science, some of it is history. So, and that's another strong interest, history. But I did sort of focus when I got into the photography seriously more on nature and landscapes. And within about a year, probably 2017, I was focusing more on the macro side of things. And there were a few reasons for that. One was that I found there was a bit less competition in the sense that, if I was entering one of my club competitions and eventually, higher level competitions, there were not as many people within the nature category doing macro as there were the bigger animals like the birds and so on, which I also love to do. And I think there's fairly obvious reasons for that, because the birds and the mammals, all these various sorts of bigger creatures are very charismatic. We love seeing them, and so we naturally want to photograph them. And so that means that it's a little bit easier for me, I think, to stand out. And I think that's one reason, to be honest, why I am doing well in the salons, because I may have a very good butterfly shot, but then it may be just as good as a very good bird shot. But because the judges have seen so many bird shots, they have a bias, unfortunately, I think. Partly depending on the type of bird, of course. So that's helped me a little bit, I think, competitively. But the other thing is that also, if you're seriously into something like, say, bird photography, as I can see somebody is there with all the birds behind them, you probably have a very good lens, don't you? A very long lens, which is very expensive. And that's something at the time I couldn't afford. Hopefully one day I'll be able to get something like that. I did manage to get a 300mm Nikon lens, but it didn't quite cut it. So the macro lens was significantly cheaper than those sorts of things, like a 600mm lens, say. My current gear is a Nikon D500, which is the top of the range crop sensor camera that Nikon does. And I chose it partly because I'd realized I'd seen that quite a lot of macro photographers used it. And it has a good autofocus system, which is very useful for nature, and a decent sensor, which is useful for all sorts of things, of course, but certainly for astrophotography, which is something else I love to do. The lens is the Nikon 105mm macro, which is a good macro lens. You don't have to use a dedicated macro lens to do this sort of photography. Let's call it close-up, because macro has a special meaning. But this sort of photography you see here with the emerald damselflies on the right. There are lots of other ways, and I expect some of you have tried other sorts of techniques, such as extension tubes. That's one thing I never tried myself, by the way. Screw-on lenses on the front. Raynox are meant to be very good for that. You can even just get a reverse ring for a couple of pounds, which allows you to turn a normal lens around the backwards, and it works as a macro lens. That's the first thing I ever did, in fact. And it is possible to get good results with all of these sorts of things, but I think it's probably easiest that, in terms of the facility of operation, and certainly you get good sharpness, something like that 105mm macro lens or the various other types of macro lenses are probably going to be the best bet. Now, I actually use, in addition to that, when I'm out in the field, a 1.4 times teleconverter. That's just a little, quite a small lens, which you put on the body, and then the macro lens goes in front of that, and it magnifies your 105 by 1.4, so you get 150. It's something that people use for getting further reach, especially for things like bird photography. That's why I got it in the first place, but I found it degraded the image. It didn't work very well with my 300mm fairly old lens. So that was a bit disappointing, but it does work with the macro lens and it gives me a bit more magnification. So that is useful in two senses. First of all, obviously one of the main attractions of macro is that you are magnifying small details, small creatures, which you can't very easily see with a naked eye, right? Things like the structure, the wings of those damselflies there, the hairs on the legs. And if you magnify even more, you can see the lenses on the eyes. They have thousands of tiny little lenses in their compound eyes. That's a wonderful thing to see. It's part of the fascination. And if you can magnify a bit more, then you see that more, right? So that's one reason to do that. Another reason to have a longer lens is to be a little bit further away, right? So with the extender on, it may only be a matter of a few inches, but a bit further away from my subject. And that allows me, gives me a slightly better chance of getting the shot before they fly off, right? You get too close, as you may have found yourselves, if you've tried this, they tend to fly off, right? In fact, my first challenge when we come to the challenges is finding your subject and getting close enough to them to actually get a shot, which can be a huge challenge. So that's why I do that. And in fact, if you look at what the really successful, well-known macro photographers use, that it tends to be quite long lenses, like a 150 or a 180 or a 200, which can be quite expensive, but get good results. Okay, so what am I trying to achieve with my photography? I sort of alluded to it before in terms of creating an artistic picture. So basically that is my aim. I'm trying to create something which depicts the beauty of nature in an artistically pleasing, aesthetically pleasing way, a pictorially satisfying picture. And that's not the only approach to nature photography, of course. People take shots for records, which is important. We need an accurate record of what species look like, don't we? Scientific purposes, and we, to record behavior, which is important, and those sorts of shots where animals are doing things are supposedly meant to be judged as better by judges within the salons and things like that, a narrative sort of picture. And that's something I'm certainly interested in, and we'll take a picture of if I see it, but that's not really what I'm aiming at when I'm going out. My main aim is to depict something that's beautiful. And so towards that aim, I will construct my picture in various ways. I'll select things and arrange things, not always, but quite often. So in this case, for example, you see these two dark green fritillaries on two scabious flowers. I arranged those flowers like that, and I actually positioned the two butterflies like that, and I made sure that the background was pleasing as well, so that the overall effect works. And I'll discuss, later on how I do all of that. Now, so in terms of the general sort of look of the image, what does it mean? What am I trying to go for in that sense? I mean, you can talk about it artistically, but in terms of how I take the picture, if you like, how I process it and that sort of thing, it tends to mean more than two things, but these two are quite important. And that is, I'm going for a sharp subject and a blurred background, a fairly nicely blurred background, let's say, with there may be some variation in colors and shades and stuff, as you see in this one. It may be fairly smooth, but it's attractive. That's the point. So why do I do that? Well, really the reason I've come to that style is because I got into serious photography by joining my camera club and entering the whole world of the PAGB, which is the clubs, the judges judging competitions in clubs, and a higher level like the federation level or national level, like the GB Cup, for example, all that sort of thing, and also the PAGB awards. They tend to have a certain mindset, a certain way of judging pictures, certainly macro pictures, where they're looking for these things, basically these two things, amongst others, obviously composition being one of the other things, and an interesting subject and behavior being other things. But these are two important things: that the subject should be sharp, by which we mean pretty much to a glance completely sharp. Nothing stands out as obviously soft, even though if you look closely, you'll see some of this is a bit soft. and yeah, and a blurred background, which means somewhat distant, probably, and with nice colors and nice light and all that sort of thing. So is that the correct approach to macrophotography? Is that what you should all be doing, or if you're into macrophotography? Well, no. I mean, it's just one approach. It's what I feel like I've been sort of channeled into by having judges say, this bit's not sharp, therefore it's not going to win this competition, that sort of thing. Whether that's my own pictures or others, I've heard it so many times that it sort of shaped me to think, right, I'm going to get it sharp. But you know, there are many other styles of macrophotography, of nature photography, which can be equally artistic, appealing, interesting, and which might not do well in you know, PAGB type competitions, but might do well in other ones, like the one you mentioned earlier, Gary, the International Garden Photographer of the Year, or there's the Close-Up Photographer of the Year, and there's Amateur Photographer of the Year. There's lots of other competitions out there which have a somewhat broader view. And here's an example of a picture which wouldn't fit the PAGB style, but which you know, I personally quite like. This is a common blue butterfly feeding, as you can see. And it's not very sharp, is it? Some of it's sharp, around the eye, the legs, the proboscis where it's feeding, some of the flowers, but a lot of it is soft. Now, there was no real way that I was going to be able to get that completely sharp. And there are a couple of reasons for that. And this relates to what we'll talk about later, so I'll mention it now. First of all, it was an active insect. Obviously, it's feeding, and so it's not going to be staying still, right? Not for more than a nanosecond. And if it's not staying still, then you can't do focus stacking, right? Which is something I do a lot to get a completely sharp subject, which I'll talk about later. So that's one thing. I couldn't focus stack it. And the second thing is the way it's holding its wings, okay? Sometimes, and depending on the species, some butterflies will hold their wings not completely closed, not completely open at, you know, 180 degrees, but at an angle like that, the angle you see there, let's estimate 90 degrees, right? And because it's at that angle, it's got a lot of depth to it, right? The front to back depth of it is quite a lot for macrophotography, and more than you would normally be able to get within your depth of field, right? So you won't be able to get all that sharp in one shot very easily, even if you had a pretty narrow aperture. And if you did use a narrow aperture, then you're not going to get all that nice, smooth background that you see there, which is part of the attraction of that picture, right? So I couldn't get it sharp, but you know, nonetheless, I quite like it. And you know, if you were to take pictures like that and it appeals to you, then that's all that matters, isn't it? I think. Having said that, we're going to move on to how I get the former style, how I achieve that, you know, where it is all sharp as well as a nice background. And so now we're on to the main part of this talk, which, as I said, is the challenges of macrophotography, and I've divided it into these 7, okay? So I'm going to go through what my approach is to solving these problems. And remember, as I said, other macrophotographers will have other approaches. There's probably as many different subtle variations of technique as there are macrophotographers, in fact, okay? So you may have a way that works for you, which is different to what I do, and you know, that's fine. Okay, first of all, we're going to look at finding and getting close to the subject so you can actually get your shots. The next 5 are what you then do with the camera, and the last one is post-processing. With something new, in fact, those of you who've seen my talk before, because I just recently bought Topaz denoise and I like it, so I'm going to talk a bit about that. Although actually I'll talk about it in the middle, I think. Anyway, so let's start with finding it and getting close to the subject. Now, in terms of finding them is a matter of not just where, but when. So we're going to talk about both of those things, okay? But as far as where to go, you could probably say quite a lot of fairly common sense things about how to find good locations to shoot insects and other interesting small creatures. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about that, but I'll say a couple of things. First of all, and this illustrates my first point, this is a location fairly close to me, about 15-minute drive. A lot of the best sort of locations, as you might expect, tend to be good in biodiversity. You tend to have quite a good range of different kinds of plants. And that's more likely to give you, especially different kinds of wildflowers, to give you a variety of things like butterflies and moths and beetles and bees and all the rest of it. Second thing I want to say is if you do find a good location like this one for me, I recommend getting very familiar with it, going there a lot. I actually go to this place, you know, when the season is underway, you know, maybe 3 or even 4 times a week. And because of that, I've got very familiar with it, and that maximizes my chances of getting good shots. You know, you have to get to know the different parts of this, like this is a country park, so it has different areas, different habitats. Even, you know, just down by the river is different from up on the top here where I took the picture. You know, what plants are there, what species of insect or other animals, where are they likely to be hiding when you can't find them, what sort of shots are possible, you know, what sort of plants and what sort of angles and what kind of backgrounds, and so on and so forth. All of this, the more you go there to the same place and practice in the same place, the more you're likely to get the better shots, is my point. In fact, that's where that exact location is where I took this shot that you saw right at the start of the 2 male banded demoiselles. One other thing I'll say about finding places, and this is just about butterflies, is the Butterfly Conservation website is really good. It has lots of information, and it's a good organisation to join, by the way. It's only £3 a month to support their work in looking after butterflies. But on this page here, in your area, they have, as you can see, that map with these markers for all the various different branches, and that's really useful. I'm guessing yours, well, I think where Dover is, it's probably the one around where it says Canterbury is closest to you, isn't it? But yes. You know, you may travel somewhere. So for me, I'm normally looking at my branch, the Lancashire and Cheshire ones, but also maybe the Derbyshire and North Wales, and maybe even further abroad. A couple of years ago, I went to Dorset, where I got some, well, my most successful image ever, in fact, I took down there. And these branch websites, they have lots of information like key sites, good locations to go to, and possibly even a page where people can record their sightings, what they saw that day, which is really useful information. You know, it's right up to the minute. And of course, there'll be equivalent things for other kinds of insects. So let's move on then. That was all about where. Let's talk about when now, because when is really critical. We're going to talk about when to find your creatures in 2 senses. First of all, when during the year. So that's what I mean by flying times. In other words, creatures like butterflies and moths, but other things too, have different life cycle stages, right? So they'll be in a flying form when you're most likely to want to photograph them at a certain time of year. And that's good to know. Of course, you may want to photograph them as caterpillars or even as eggs. But you know, that's good to know, and also it brings variety. You know, so as you'll see in a moment, I'm going to show you some examples. You know, you have certain creatures that are out at different times of year, which means you have things to look forward to in the next week or month that's coming up. We're also going to look at time in the sense of time of day, which is just as important. But first of all, as I said, I'll show you some examples of what you might expect to see at different times of year. So one of the first butterflies that you would normally see in the year is the comma, as it says March there, right? So we're coming towards the end of March, and I haven't seen a single butterfly yet this year. So of course this depends on you know, the weather primarily. It's been cold. I don't know what it's been like down there, but up here it's been cold. It's not quite hit the right temperature for these things to emerge and for me to have seen them. So it's been a bit disappointing. I've been focusing on other things basically. But normally we would, and also the same goes for the small tortoise shell, which a lot of these have a fairly dull underside to be camouflaged when their wings are closed. But when they open up and they're displaying to you know, to try and find a mate, they're much more colourful on the top, a lot of them. This is the orange tip, one of my favourites. It's male. The male has the actual orange tip, the female has a black tip. Around April and May, so hopefully, you know, in a couple of weeks we will actually see some of those. The green veined white, another very pretty one, very small, around the same time, April and May. A lot of these, certainly with butterflies, they will often have another brood, so you see them at one time of the year and then they go through the life cycle and you see them again later in the year, possibly even 3 times, but again dependent on weather conditions. Common blue, around May and June, and again later on in the year. really tiny but very pretty little thing. This one is what got highly commended in International Garden Photographer of the Year last year. Yeah, last year. The ringlet, not quite as colourful, but still nice. June and July. Small heath, another tiny one, in June and then September. The meadow brown, quite a common one, at least up here. Looking at this one now, I think I'm going to run that through Topaz Denoise because it's a little bit noisy. Marbled white, one of my favourites. You can see why it's called that marbled pattern. Really stunning, I think. We don't have these up here where I am. I'm sure you'll have them down where you are. They're much more common down south. This I took in Dorset on that trip a couple of years ago. The Gatekeeper around the same time, July and August. Dark green Fritillary, another one of my favourites, around the same time, July and August. The Painted Lady, peaking in August. This is a migrant. In fact, amazingly to me, it actually flies across the Sahara Desert, this tiny little thing. Those are all butterflies, but there are actually a lot more species of moth in the world generally, and certainly in the UK. Even just the larger moths, there's over 800 species, and about, I think it's 59 in butterflies. The cinnabar moth, as are many other moths, is photogenic. The striking colours are black and an intense red. The 6-spot burnet moth, there's other types as well as a 5-spot with a similar sort of colouring, although the background is a sort of metallic green, which is really incredible, I think, and the red stands out even more, I think, on that. And some eggs, yes, I mentioned eggs earlier. These are moth eggs. I don't know what species, because I've not gone through all the 800 odd to try and find out. But this to me nicely illustrates the power of macro photography, because if you had seen this, and this was September last year, so if you're looking out, you know, this September, and you see this, all it will appear to be is a sort of patch of grey on a bit of grass, and you might think nothing of it. But then magnified, as you know, with that 150mm lens, as much as I could magnify it, this is what was revealed. This incredible pattern, these beautiful sort of star shapes on each egg. So that was all about the sorts of creatures, just a few examples of the sorts of creatures that you know, most macro photographers are going to photograph in the main season, starting in the spring, going through to the summer and a little bit into the autumn. But what happens when we get to the autumn and there's not as many of those sorts of things around, and then into the winter and into the new year? Well, you can do macro all year round, really. I mean, sometimes it's a little bit more difficult than others, definitely, especially in the very dead of winter. But there are other things to photograph. Spiders, for example. I find that the webs certainly are the best in autumn, when you get the nice sparkly dewdrops on them. Fungi, I love to do fungi, and I'm creating a new talk called Flora, actually, which is going to have all my plant and fungus images, you know, flowers and leaves and various other things. And with fungi, they are again not around all year, but seem to be best in the autumn, especially October, at least in terms of the most photogenic species. I'll show you a couple of examples in a minute of those. Autumn leaves can be nice to photograph. I like to do various things, like I've got a light pad, and I like to do collages of leaves and things like that. Things to do with ice and snowflakes. And then once we get to the new year, you start to get the spring flowers, things like the snowdrops starting in January, and then eventually crocuses, bluebells, and so on and so forth. As I said, all that stuff we'll be putting in another talk. I'll show you a few examples though. So a couple of examples of fungus photography. This, of course, is the fly agaric, the famous toadstool. For me, the challenge of fungus photography is less the taking of the picture compared to, you know, an insect, because it's not going to move, it's not going to fly off, and it won't even wobble that much in the wind, because they tend to have fairly thick stalks. I mean, it depends, some of them have thin stalks, but they also tend to be in fairly sheltered areas, you know, woods and forests. The challenge is actually finding a good specimen, because a lot of the time it's not, you know, the species are not that attractive to start with, or they're in poor condition, you know, sort of decayed or half eaten, things like that. So if you find a good specimen, you're half the way there. These are angel's bonnets, which is one of my favorites. The reason it's in monochrome, by the way, is because I entered this into Amateur Photographer of the Year last year in the monochrome round, and it came fourth. And what I do a lot with these sorts, but where they have a typical sort of bonnet cap stalk shape, is I'll light them with my LED panel. I've got a 480 LED panel, which I'll put behind and below, so it's shining up, and that sort of fills them with light, which I think makes it more attractive. A lot of people do that. This one has done well in the recent salons, actually got commended recently. These are common bonnets, and actually this day I went to these woods to do landscape photography, to do the misty sort of forest kind of thing. But I noticed these down on the ground, and so I did focus stack it, but I used my 18-55 lens so I could get the broader view. So I suppose it's close-up rather than macro, isn't it? It's sort of a close-up shot. Spiders can be quite interesting, I think, especially if they've got attractive webs, which this one isn't, or if they're doing something interesting like feeding on a bright red ladybird. And as I said before, the webs can be very attractive when they've got those dewdrops on them. You need to be there fairly early in the morning to get the right sort of sunlight, and you want to be pointing roughly towards the sun to get those nice colours. As I said, I like to do spring flowers. This is just an attempt to do something a little bit different. To do this, basically, I'm shooting towards the sun again, and to get those sort of nice blobs of light, I'm just spraying spray from a water bottle. You need a fairly fast shutter speed for it to work, so you need to have reasonably bright sunlight. Otherwise, you don't get a fast enough shutter speed. Here's one of the very few examples where I've not, got it completely sharp, like that butterfly at the start. I do like to do crocuses, and in this case, I just found it was more attractive when I hadn't focus stacked it and got it fully sharp. Just a little bit at the front, that sort of blurriness of most of the petals just look nicer to me, I think. Okay, so what about lockdown that we've had recently, or a time of year when you just feel like there's nothing out there to photograph, or the weather's horrible and you don't want to go out? Well, then you can do work indoors. And I've been doing a lot of studio work. Well, I call it a studio. It's really the dining room, but it's basically become my studio. The room I'm in right now, in fact, and I've been doing various different things. So I got a black Perspex sheet to try some reflections, which I've done a lot with flowers, but I also found a dead bee in the porch, and so I had a go at that. And I brought some snowdrops in from the back garden. There are lots of benefits to studio work, and and some downsides as well. But one thing is you got a lot more control of the conditions. There's no wind. You can control the light. And you can experiment with things like the background. This is just a bit of blue card. I've been doing some droplet refraction photography as well. There'll be a lot more of this in that other talk I mentioned, Flora. Okay, so all that was all about what kinds of things you can photograph at different times of year, right? And I think you can do something, whether it's indoor or outdoor, at any time, pretty much. So now we're going to talk about time of day, because that is really important, just as important as time of year. And the reason for that is that insects are exothermic. What that means is that they don't produce their own heat. They need the warmth of the sun to be active, whereas we as mammals, and other mammals and birds, eat quite a lot because we burn a lot of that food off to produce heat to keep us warm. And the benefit of that is that we can survive in much colder environments than, say, insects or reptiles, where they just can't do very much. They just have to sort of lie there if they're cold. Whereas we can be active, we can do whatever we need to do. The downside is we have to eat a lot more. So, like a crocodile can go without food for 6 months. And, if we did that, we wouldn't manage it, would we? So this is a very important fact in macro photography, because basically it determines whether you're going to be able to see things very easily or not, okay? And whether they're going to be flying off when you approach them. So butterfly conservation guidelines say that if you're going to record on a transect, it needs to be 17 degrees C, or if it's pretty much fully sunny, then 13 degrees C. Because if it's not those temperatures, then you won't really see them. They're not active, they're not able to be active. So below about 12 degrees, butterflies enter a state called by the scientists quiescence, which basically means that their metabolism slows down because they're just not warm enough for it to work. They become sort of dormant, sort of sluggish, sort of docile. They can't really move very much. They may be able to move a little bit, depending on how cold it is. If it's really cold, then they just won't be able to move at all. If it's a little bit cold, they may be able to crawl a bit or flap their wings a little bit, but they can't behave in their natural form. And this, this is why I've not seen any butterflies yet this year, because it's been cold. However, if it warms up, if the sun comes out and they warm up and they reach that temperature required to be active, then they very quickly become active again. Okay, so pretty much immediately they can be flying off. That temperature I mentioned there was for butterflies, and it varies depending on the type of insect. So you will see, for example, bees active at lower temperatures. Honeybees, quite a lot lower potentially. This is a bumblebee. And I saw this in a lavender field not too far from me, well, less than an hour drive anyway, a lavender field in Cheshire. Went there one morning, pretty early. It was, even though it was August, it was quite cool. There were no butterflies around, even though a couple of hours later when the sun had come up, there were lots of butterflies, but none when I first got there. Honeybees were pretty active, bumblebees, a little bit, some of them a little bit active, not really flying around that much. And some of them were just sitting on the stalk like this, quiescent, even though, I could come fairly close and they wouldn't fly off, which means that I was able to set up my tripod, choose an angle so that, it was attractive, and get several shots, nice and sharp. And also it wasn't windy, that's the critical thing I'll talk about later. And do focus stacking so that I've got a fully sharp, I think as far as I can see, pretty much sharp final result. Here's another example. So, this is about a year ago in my local place I mentioned earlier. A comma on blackthorn, which I'd positioned there. But when I first arrived, it was pretty cold. In fact, the ground was frosty. I'm only estimating it was about 5 degrees when I took this picture, because the sun had actually risen and was shining, as you can see. But yeah, it was pretty cold, and because the insect was pretty cold, it could not move. So it stayed there for the time that I needed to set up my tripod, again, make sure everything was framed up and positioned correctly and composed and all the rest of it, get nice shots, focus stack it at home and get a good final result. So this situation with the temperature and quiescence, that gives us a catch-22, okay? So you can go early in the morning, like I did with those last two shots, when it's cool or even cold. They are then much less active, right? Which makes them a lot easier to photograph, but also harder to find. You may be lucky, like in that lavender field, there were things out there available to shoot. You may even find a butterfly out on top of a flower or something, roosting overnight. But a lot of the time, they have gone deep underground and in the undergrowth, deep under the layers of vegetation, right? So that you don't really see them out in the open, or they may be up in a tree, something like that. And, it makes sense for them to do that as an adaptation, right? Because if you're an insect which can't fly off when a bird is approaching, you don't really want to be out in the open, do you? You want to be hidden. Okay, so, right, I just noticed something in the chat, so I'm just going to keep an eye on that. Do I focus stack by hand or do I tether to a laptop? No, so I'll talk about how I do it later, but I don't tether to a laptop, although it's probably a good idea. Mostly it's when I've got the camera on the tripod, and I'll explain how I do it later. I'll come to that later, how I do the focus stacking. So you can go early in the morning, as I said there, easier to photograph but harder to find. And by the way, in terms of finding them, this is where knowing your location comes in, right? The better you know your location and your species, the more likely you are to find them, right? Or you can go later in the day when it's warmer and they're more active. You'll see them flying around, easy to find, but now much harder to photograph, unfortunately. So you see the catch-22. You can see them, but you can't photograph them. You can't see them, and you can photograph them. Yeah, so when they're warmer and they're more active, there's two reasons why they're harder to photograph. One is that they just aren't settling, right? So you know they're flying from place to place. They may land, but they don't land there for very long. They just go from place to place to place. You're constantly chasing after them, and you never get to the place where they are before they fly off. Or they may settle for longer, but because they're alert and active, they see you coming. So they see you as a threat, and you get close and they're off. So it's difficult, not impossible. It can be done, and I'll talk a bit about how to stalk, how to get closer in a minute. What I do mostly, and I would say, you know, probably 3/4 of the time, which a rough estimate, is I do go early in the morning, and that's what a lot of macro photographers do. They do for the same reason. They want to try and find things when they're cold, because then they've got the time to get a good shot. When you've got time, you know, you've got a much better chance of getting a good shot. So if you aren't doing that, if you're going when it's later, when it's warmer, then as I said, you need good stalking technique, right? And that is something I do. I also do that. So let's talk about how to stalk, how to get close enough to get a shot. I've got a few suggestions. First of all, try to get down low before you get near them. And the reason for that is if you just walk up in a normal way, you're probably going to be above them, right? They'll be on some plant. And to them, you're going to make a great big shape against the sky, a dark shape against the sky, right? Now, they don't have very good vision in the sense of being able to resolve strong, precise detail. So they can't see who it is, you know, or even that it's a person, but they just see a shape that's a threat. And so they fly off. If you can get lower down, which of course may be difficult depending on the state of your knees, etc. But if you can get lower down, you blend more into the background, right? You're going to stand out a lot less. The second thing is the way you move. Okay, so even though they don't have very good sharpness of vision, they are very much attuned to movement. Okay, and obviously what they're wanting to see and avoid is a predator, like a bird. And think about the way that animals move versus the way other things that are moving around them that are not a threat. And that's the plant sort of swaying in the breeze, pretty much, isn't it? So if you can move less like an animal and more like a plant, that's going to help too. So sort of slower, smoother movement. A couple of other things I can say. First of all, you can see that I've got right down here, right? And the thing is, you also get a better view, a better shot if you're at the same level as they are. But also, a lot of these creatures have good color vision, so it's better if you don't wear brightly colored clothes, like a bright red or something that's going to really stand out. You know, I wouldn't say camouflage like I'm wearing is essential, but you know, dull color clothing, and also the hat. Sometimes you can be, you know, following a creature like that common blue butterfly, if you can see it there, flying around. You're watching it, trying to see where it's going to land, and it just sort of magically disappears. And the thing is, it's just so small against such a busy background that your brain just can't keep track of that thing. And so to see these little things, it really helps to shade your eyes. So a wide brim hat, especially if it's sunny, but even if it's not sunny, a wide brim hat really helps. Okay, so all of that was just getting near to our subject, right? Let's say we have got close. Well, there's a lot more to it, right? We've got to get a good picture now with our camera, and the next 5 are about that. And the next one which we can talk about is depth of field, which is a massive issue for macro photography. And normally I'll do that and then break, if that's okay, just have a short 5-minute break. Okay, so let's talk about depth of field. We mean by that the range of distance from the camera which is in focus, right? So you can see this line coming from the camera towards the butterfly. We have 2 lines here marking 2 distances, these vertical lines, 2 distances from the camera. Between those 2 lines, it's sharp, right? The butterfly is sharp. Before and after those lines, it's soft. So the distance between those 2 lines where we've got sharpness, that is our depth of field. And depth of field, of course, varies a lot depending on the different situation, you know, what you're photographing, the lens, etc., the aperture. And we're going to look at that in a minute, what actually affects depth of field. But the problem for macro photography is that you get a very small depth of field. Even though you're shooting a small creature, you generally don't get enough depth of field to get the whole thing sharp in one go, or rarely. It can happen, but rarely, depending on the type of shot you're doing. Let's look at what affects depth of field then. So it's three things. First of all, the focal length of your lens, right? So the longer the focal length of your lens, the less depth of field you get. Now I'm tending to use 150mm, and that's pretty much what I'll always use when I'm out in the field. And that's quite long though, isn't it? So that's not helping that much. Second thing is the distance to the subject. So the closer you are to it, again, the less depth of field you get. But of course, we need to be fairly close, don't we? But there is some variability there, some flexibility in the sense that it depends what sort of shot you're going for. If you're going for a shot where the subject is pretty small in the frame, that sort of environmental shot, you're going to get more depth of field. Or if you, unlike me, if you have a full frame camera with a lot more pixels, you can be further away and then crop in and still have enough pixels to get all the detail you want, right? But for me, I tend to be a certain distance away to get a certain composition, a certain size of the creature in the frame. So and that's usually about 2 feet away. So there's not much variability there for me. Aperture, of course, the wider your aperture, the less depth of field you get, right? For me, aperture is the most flexible thing because I'm sticking to my 150mm and usually a certain distance away. And I'm always on aperture priority, so I can control that. But what aperture do I actually use? Well, let's think about it. So what we see here is what I did here was I went on this website you see at the bottom, PhotoPills, to work out using this calculator the depth of field that I would get for those three things that I just went through, for my my focal length, 150mm, distance from the subject, 60 centimeters here, and then all these different apertures. And these are the numbers I got, okay? Now, they may not be correct because I'm using a teleconverter, so I'm not sure about that, but that doesn't matter. The precise numbers don't matter here. What matters is two things we can see. First of all, if you go from f4.5, which is as wide as I can go with the teleconverter on, as we go narrower and narrower down to 9, 10, 11, 12, and so on up to 16, we can see that the depth of field is increasing, right? So the narrower you go, the more depth of field you get, right? The second thing is that these numbers are very small. We're getting very little depth of field. Even if the true numbers are bigger than that, they're still very small. And I can definitely confirm from my experience that you don't get much depth of field. Of course, you know, if you go further back, you'll get more. If you use a shorter lens, you'll get more, and so on. So my range tends to be here, f10, 11, 13, because I do want more depth of field to try and get more of it sharp. I don't want to go narrower, or not much. I mean, I might go to 14 or 16, but I don't want to go much narrower because, mainly because it's going to make the background too busy, basically. It's going to bring the background into focus and make it unattractive. So we're going to illustrate this now with a sequence of pictures showing this painted lady. And we're going to start with f16, and we're going to see what effect it has on the butterfly and the background as we open up the aperture to illustrate all of this, okay? Now f16, that butterfly is pretty sharp, that's good. But the background for me is, you know, as I just said, it's quite kind of blotchy, isn't it? It's not great. It's only about 4 meters away. But that's, you know, that's what you might encounter in the field, you know, a background about that far away. Let's see what happens when we open it up. F14, the background's got a little bit softer and the subject is pretty sharp still. Same at F13, F11. I mean, if you look, oops, sorry, F11, that background is quite a lot better than it was at F16, isn't it? And the subject is still pretty sharp. But once we get to F10, you can see now that we're starting to get softness in the butterfly. You see on the left there and on the left antenna. The background's getting better because it's softer, but the butterfly is getting worse because it's softer for the same reason, right? Once we get to f4.5, that background is much, much better. It's much more attractive. We've got 2 dark areas, which we might be able to fix in post-processing. But otherwise it's quite nice. But the butterfly is got a lot of softness now. So this brings us to possibly the central problem of macro photography, which is how do you get a sharp insect and a nicely blurred background at the same time? How do you get both things? If that's the style you're going for, you may not be bothered about that, because obviously that's absolutely fine. But if you are going for this, how do we do it? Well, I've got 3 solutions which I'm going to go through now. Okay, 3 things I do almost every time. My first solution is that I use that narrow aperture that I just mentioned, like f10, 11, 13, usually 11 or 13 actually. But as well as that, a distant background. So making sure the background is quite far away, which is about how you position yourself, basically. What subject you choose to photograph, is there actually a potential for a distant background? And how do you, orient yourself so that you are getting that distant background, okay? Here's a typical situation. The butterfly feeding on a flower there. Just think for a second what you would actually do in that situation. I'll tell you what I would do. Nothing. I would just wait, because the vegetation is immediately around it, isn't it? I mean, it's right there. There's not even a moderate gap there. There's no gap at all, really. So there's no chance of getting a nice background there. Certainly not a nice smooth sort of background like you've been seeing, that nice bouquet. So I just wait and let it go somewhere else. Okay, so distant background, this is the first thing. Second thing, make sure the camera is perpendicular to the plane of the subject. Okay, what do I mean by that? Well, let's think about the plane of the subject. So if you're talking about a butterfly or a dragonfly, damselfly, you can probably think about it having a certain plane, right? As we can see illustrated here. We're looking from above. So in this case, this butterfly, the plane of it is its body and wings, right? If the wings are closed or if they're fully open, not if they're sort of at that 90-degree angle, but if they're fully open or fully closed, you've got a plane, haven't you? You've got a flat surface, right? So it's a matter of identifying where that is and then trying to arrange yourself so that a line from the camera to that plane is making a right angle, which this isn't here, right? Or to think of it another way, that plane should be parallel to the sensor in your camera, right? So it isn't in the first one or the second one, but it is in the third one. So why do we want it like that? Well, it's all about depth of field if you're trying to get it sharp. Let me just illustrate with annotate, okay? Right, so I'm going to draw a line marking the closest point of this subject here to the camera, which is that tip of the wing there, right? So that marks that distance there to the camera there. Now, the furthest point is actually the tip of that antenna there, isn't it? But I'm going to ignore the antennae for now, and we'll come back to those later. So let's say it's this part of the body here, the far side of the head. Let's draw another line. So that roughly is the depth of field that you would need to get all of that sharp in one go, right? If you were positioned like that. Same with the second one, but look at the third one. If we draw the same 2 lines marking the closest and furthest points, I'm not drawing it very well, but you get the idea. It's a lot less, isn't it? Because of that being a right angle there, perpendicular, that means we don't need anywhere near as much depth of field to get it all sharp. So we're more likely to get it sharp or more of it sharp, right? So that's a really useful thing to do. It's about how you've got to look for that plane and you've got to position yourself the right way to it. Now, of course, if you're talking about a creature that's more of a round shape, like a bee or some beetles, for example, it can be a bit harder to identify that plane. But with these sorts of creatures, it makes a big difference. Okay. So, a couple of examples of that. No, I did an extra bit of. There we go. Right. Okay. So as you can see here, we've got a female orange tip, and she's got her wings open at that awkward angle, right? Which means there is no single plane. There's really 2 planes with the 2 wings, which means that very little of it is sharp, right? There's no way to be perpendicular to all of that, right? Whereas with this next one, which is a damselfly called a yellow waxtail, damselflies hold their wings along their bodies. Dragonflies hold them out sideways, right? So by positioning myself like that, I was perpendicular to that plane and got it more or less sharp, most of it sharp, right? I also made sure the background was distant enough that that was nicely blurred as well. Right. Okay, so even at f13, however, it's likely some parts will still be blurred. Okay, and here we're going to come back to the antennae. So here we have dark green fritillary, reasonably sharp, but as you can see, the antennae are soft, right? And that's because of the way they're being held. Very often, a lot of insects will hold their antennae out sideways, right? Sort of V shape. So that one is close to the camera, that one's further away, and they're not in the depth of field that I had at f11 when I took this shot, right? So that is very often the case. You know, it's quite often that some parts of it don't fall in your depth of field. So what do we do then? Well, then we come to our third solution, which is the focus stack, which I've already mentioned a few times. And this is something I do a lot, almost every day, to be honest. It's quite a complex thing, though, and it could take a whole evening really to fully explain it. So I'm just going to give you a sort of overview. What do we mean by focus stacking? So focus stacking, means basically that you do it because you can't get the subject sharp in one shot, right? So you take more than one. It may just be two. I've done it loads of times with just two. Could be 3, could be 60, could be 100. It depends on various factors, right? In this case, with this particular subject here, this dark green fritillary, I only needed 3. So what you need to do, there's 2 things you need to do, okay, before you can get a final fully sharp image. First of all, you have to get what I call full coverage. In other words, you have to make sure that you've got complete sharpness, but the thing is it's in different pictures, right? So in the first shot, for example, you've got most of it sharp. In the second shot, the back right antenna is sharp. In the bottom left one, the front antenna is sharp. So within those 3 pictures, I've got all of it sharp, but just the sharpness spread out in different pictures, right? But if you've got that, then hopefully the software, like Photoshop, which is what I use, will be able to piece together all those separate sharp parts like a jigsaw, pretty much exactly like a jigsaw, right? That's how it does it. It works out where the sharp parts are. The second thing you have to do is down to the fact that when it does the processing, when the software does the focus stacking, it has to first align the images on top of each other, right? It creates a stack of images before it blends them. That stack, they all have to match each other, right? So if, for example, this butterfly between that shot and that shot had raised its wing a bit, then they would not match. They wouldn't align and it wouldn't be able to focus stack properly, right? So in other words, you got to be careful that it doesn't move, right? Now, how do we do that? Well, one thing you can do is take your shot when it's cold, right? So that's what I did in this situation. It was on the flower, cold in the morning. I positioned it there. It didn't move because, at least most of it didn't move, as we'll see, because it was cold. The second thing is to take your shots quickly, right? As it happens, it did move its antennae. Do you see the 2 antennae? The gap between them is increasing. So actually, it did move its antennae, which caused problems for the focus stacking later on. So I had to do a bit of cutting and pasting in the end. So how do I actually get the shots? Okay, and this relates to the question somebody asked me earlier. Different photographers will have different methods, okay? But what I do, because I've got a D500 Nikon, what I'll do is have it on the tripod, have it on live view. So imagine this shot at the top left here is the live view, okay? Then I can just touch with my finger a spot like, let's say, the eye, and it will autofocus on that spot and take the shot there. I could then do the same on the far tip of the wing, which I normally do just in case it's not exactly the same distance away. And then I'll do the same thing on the 2 antennae, okay? And basically I'll do more shots than I think I need just to be sure that I've got full coverage, right? Sometimes that little focus square, it can't actually pick out a little thing like that little antenna there. And so I'll switch to manual focus and I'll zoom in and manually focus on that antenna, right? Which takes a little bit longer, increases the risk that it moves in between. there are other techniques. If anyone wants to know any other techniques that other people use, I can tell you in the break to get the shots. If I'm doing mushrooms, by the way, I'll do it all on manual. I'll put it on manual focus and turn the focus ring by hand because there's so much more depth of field there. It's easier to do it that way. But if you do it that way, then the final result is that nice, completely sharp image, right? Which to me is better. Okay, so a couple more things before we break. So here we are. This is my most successful image ever, the one I took in Dorset in 2019. The 3 marbled whites, 2 males and a female. So do I always focus stack? No, I don't always focus stack. In this case, I didn't have to. And the reason I didn't have to here is because to get all 3 of those in one shot, I had to be a bit further away to fit them in, right? Because I was further away, I had more depth of field. And because I positioned them all to be in the same plane, they all fit in the depth of field, more or less, close enough. The hard part, therefore, was not so much the shot, taking the actual shot, it was getting them there, all 3 there in the same plane without, you know, 1 or more of them flying off, which happened a lot before I managed to get 3 of them. And another thing is, this is the sort of setup that I would use. Okay, so this is actually my back garden, but on one of those nice cold mornings when the insect is not going to fly off, this is what I'll do. I'll have my camera on a tripod and then another tripod with a clamp. I don't use these anymore, but you can get these on eBay fairly cheap. But I now use Wimberley clamps, which are much better, much lighter, more flexible, much more expensive. But the point is that I'll do that so I can find a good plant. This horsetail I just found in the garden. I can stick it in the clamp, and I can get everything nicely set up with it, you know, so it's all framed up in the live view. It looks good. The background looks good. The plant is in the right position, ready for the insect, and then I can position the insect. And the way I do that would be, depending on the type, really. Some insects, if they're big enough and strong enough, you can do it by hand if you're careful and you know what you're doing. But frequently you can do it without touching them. And certainly a small butterfly like this, I would never touch directly because you tend to get the scales off their wings go into your finger. You get this sort of powder, which doesn't harm them, but it's, you know, it affects their colouring. So what you could do with this sort of thing is you could use something, I use a paintbrush, but you could use a stalk of grass and you just sort of gently encourage it to crawl onto that stalk of grass, and then you transfer it by, again, sort of just rotating it, and eventually it'll crawl onto where you want it to be, onto there, and then you can get your shot. The reflector I'll talk about later. I'll talk about light and things like that later on. Okay, so if it's okay, we will pause there just briefly, that's right. So feel free to unmute and speak.
Right, well, thank you, Tony, for that so far. That's excellent. I shall pause the recording there and try and remember after the short break to...
Okay, so the 3 options are being handheld, using a monopod and a tripod. So I will use any of these depending on various factors, because they vary in terms of the things you see there, flexibility and steadiness. So a tripod, of course, is the steadiest, and I've described how I use a tripod when the insect is cold, and I've got another tripod with the plant on it and the insect on the plant, right? And it's best to use a tripod then because you're getting the steadiest shot and it's supporting the weight of the camera. As I said, I can just easily take the shots by touching the back of the screen. And hopefully the insect will not move. The problem with a tripod is that it's not flexible in terms of repositioning yourself. So if that insect does move some way, let's say it just moves around a little bit on the plant, whatever, or goes to another plant, then you can't really reposition yourself with a tripod to get it all framed up in time. You just haven't got the time to do that because it will move again. So in that situation with an active insect, I would normally be handheld, or possibly monopod, but frequently I'll be my handheld because that gives you a lot of flexibility. You can much more quickly and easily move to where you need to be. The downside, of course, is that you have to hold that camera, which might be heavy, and you've got to keep it steady to get a sharp shot. So there are various things you can do to make sure it's more steady. You saw a picture of me earlier where I was on the ground, had both my elbows on the ground, so that was giving it some stability. Very often, if I'm crouching or sitting down, I'll put my elbow on my leg to give more steadiness. One thing that really helps a lot, I would say, is if you do have to get down, to be comfortable. If you low down, either on the ground, crouching or sitting, don't be in a position where you have to strain, lean over or something, and it's awkward and difficult to hold the camera steady, because it's going to be much harder to do that. One thing you can do is to bring a folding stool, which helps you to get down lower, to get that shot and to be comfortable, and to bring somebody with you who can help you get up again if that's difficult. In between those two extremes, we have the monopod, which gives you a bit of both, gives you more steadiness than handheld and supports the camera, and more flexibility of movement than a tripod. So a lot of macro photographers do use a monopod. Okay, let's move on to our fourth challenge, which is subject movement. So we're talking about living creatures which may move either under their own devices or because they're on something like a plant which is moving in wind or breeze, right? And that can, again, cause problems in getting a nice sharp image. So let's look at some ideas for that. First of all, I would say avoid windy days. So I'm always looking at the weather forecast, checking for temperature, of course, and usually if it's going to be cloudy or sunny. And we'll talk about light soon, in fact. But I'm also going to be looking at the wind speed, and I want it to be lower than 10 miles an hour, because windy days make life extremely difficult for the macro photographer when everything's moving around so much. Of course, it's rare that you get a completely still day. So if there's a bit of a breeze, I have a couple of suggestions for that. First of all, use plants with sturdy stalks. Yes, so try to take shots of your subject on plants where they have stalks that are not going to flop around as easily in the breeze, and some are much sturdier than others and easier to photograph on. Another thing is to just be patient. If you wait for the wind to die down, then you'll get the more likely to get the sharper, better shots, right? So just be a bit patient. Thirdly, avoid subjects which won't stay still. And I mentioned this earlier, the subjects which will just fly from one place to another and never seem to stay still. And you can chase them for hours and get very frustrated, never get a good shot, never get close enough. I would say just don't bother, really. Go for situations, subjects, times, temperatures, etc., which are going to make it easier for you. Fourthly, mating subjects move less. And, insects that are mating is going to give you a good action shot, a narrative shot, which judges are supposed to like. So let's have a look at some examples. Here we have two 5-spot burnet moths, and these moved hardly at all in 20 or 30 minutes because they were mating, even though it was a warm afternoon in the summer. So that gave me time to use my tripod again and get the shots. This is one that I put into my DPA-GB set. Two mating hoverflies. Hoverflies may, stay still for a little while, but because they were mating, they stayed still with me holding that piece of grass in the breeze to keep it steady, a lot longer than they would have done if they weren't mating. And the fifth thing is what I've already said, which is to go early in the morning, go when it's cold or cool. That, by the way, that for me, that usually means in the summer being there at about 6 o'clock in the morning. Which is, I'm not an early riser, so that's a bit of an effort for me, but it's just beautiful to be out at that time, really. It's quiet, the light can be really nice, and you've got a better chance of getting the shots. Okay, let's move on to light and shutter speed. So what sort of shutter speed do we need? Well, for the sorts of shots that I'm taking, I'm usually shooting at around somewhere between 1/100th of a second and 1/200th of a second, which seems to be enough, seems to be okay. So let's look at what affects shutter speed. So of course, your aperture, right? So the wider your aperture, the faster your shutter speed. But we want a fairly narrow aperture, at least that's what I tend to do, as I said, f11 or 13. So that's not helping so much. So if you are at all struggling with your shutter speed, If it's not quite fast enough, then of course we have our ISO. We can raise our ISO, right? The problem with ISO is that if you go too high, you get grain, you get noise in your picture. So the question is, how high can you go? Well, it really depends on two things, right? First of all, how well does your camera deal with high ISOs? And cameras vary a lot. Modern, more expensive cameras are really good. So far I've been sticking at maybe 800, maybe 1,000, not going much beyond that because of noise. But the second thing is, of course, what you can do to reduce that noise in processing. So far I've been using Lightroom, and I thought that was doing a good job. But actually, I recently, just a couple of days ago, in fact, bought Topaz Denoise and found that it's a lot better. It only cost me about £51. I got a 15% off code, and I would say it's well worth it. It's going to allow me now to go higher ISOs and therefore get a higher percentage of keepers, shoot in slightly darker conditions. So I'm just going to look at that now, just in case you're interested in what's out there. There are other things out there, of course, that are meant to be just as good, but I'm going to compare Topaz Denoise versus Lightroom now. So this is a shot of a honeybee I took last week, and it's quite cropped in, and it's 1,000 ISO, so you can see it's fairly noisy. I mean, I don't know how much you can actually see that as it's coming through on Zoom, but it is fairly noisy, right? Quite grainy. So I ran it through Denoise, and to me that is significantly better. I'll just go back again. That's in Lightroom. You can see it says LR at the top, and Denoise, significantly better, I would say. Let's look at one more example. This is just a leaf. If you look in the middle of that leaf, this is at 3,200 now, right? The background is pretty noisy, and it's not very sharp in the middle, is it? Now this is with Denoise, and to me that's much sharper in the middle, a much better background. So see why I bought it. And even at 5,000 ISO, which is something I would never even dreamed of doing any photography at, to be honest. This is in Lightroom, and that's Denoise. So yeah, recommend it. The third factor, of course, is lights. So the ambient light conditions, the brighter you have the light, the faster your shot. But of course, if you're going in the early morning, it can be darker, right? Well, it is going to be usually darker. So if it is quite dark in the morning, normally I would avoid it. Although now I've got this Denoise and I can go a bit higher with the ISO, I guess I can now go out when it's slightly darker than I have been going. What about if it's cloudy but bright? Well, yes, definitely. With a high enough ISO, certainly yes, go out when it's cloudy but bright. And I found that that actually works well with some subjects. So, for example, white butterflies, like some of the ones you've already seen and we'll see later on. Like the two that won a gold medal, in fact, the 3 green veined whites and the 2 orange tips were both in cloudy conditions. And you can also take lots of shots, take more than you think you will need, because that increases the chance that some of them will be sharp. Now, somebody asked about flash earlier, right? We talked a bit in the break about this. So yes, you can use artificial light, and I would probably think that most macro photographers do actually use some sort of artificial light, like flashes. Like my mentor, she has a Canon flash, and I think there is a Nikon version, similar thing, but it fits on the front of the lens, and it's got 2 separate flexible arms with 2 separate flashes that you can vary not just the angle but the level of, and she really has mastered the art of using that and produces great looking pictures. I mentioned that I have an LED panel, which I did try with Instax, and I didn't like the look of it, as with flash. It just looked unnatural to me. So I don't use any artificial light with the Instax. I do use the LED panels with fungi, like I mentioned. Reflectors, you can use reflectors to get a bit of extra light, and I actually have used that a few times with my Instax, because I guess it's a bit of a less intense, and it's a very natural coloured light, obviously. I'll show you a few examples where I've used a reflector, which is literally just a piece of silver card for me. That's what was in that photo on the other clamp before, when you saw the tripod with the clamps. Here we have 2 common blues, and this was a fairly sort of dark spot, and it was looking a bit too dim, and I think I was struggling with shutter speed. So I just held out with my hand the reflector, the silver card, and aimed the light onto them and lit them up just enough to get the shot. This is a meadow grasshopper. And this was actually a reasonably bright, cloudy afternoon in the summer. So I probably could have done this without a reflector, but I just tried it and it just added something, added a bit of extra clarity, sparkle, brightness. Small Heath, this was on a pretty dull morning, and it was looking quite dull, the insect, in the live view. So I think I might have used a clamp this time to hold the reflector, which saves you some trouble of holding it yourself. And it lit it up. You can see all the hairs there, can't you? Nicely lit up, which makes a big difference, I think. Now this is green veined white. I did in the back garden last year, and it was a pretty dull morning. So I was up to ISO 1000, and I still only got a 30th of a second, which you might think is not enough, right, for a living subject. But the thing is, it was also very cold that morning, so it was really still. So because of that, and there's no wind, because of that, I managed to get a sharp enough shot, more or less, even at a 30th of a second. Okay, so what about sunny mornings? Early sunny mornings, yes, you can get very nice light, great for all sorts of photography like landscapes, and it works for certain subjects in macro really well too, especially I find if they've got those sort of shiny insect type bodies or iridescent patterns or even metallic sort of patterns like the banded demoiselles. And you can do other interesting things with that light, like backlit effects, something I want to do a lot more. Doesn't work with all subjects, but if the light comes through nicely, it works. You can do silhouettes, all sorts of things. The downside is that if it is sunny and the sun is rising, then they'll come out of quiescence faster, right? I mentioned that I might be out at 6 o'clock. If it's completely sunny, by 7:30, they may be active again, right? Whereas if it's cloudier, I'll have a lot longer than that. And the other thing is that to warm up, they'll bask. They'll open their wings to bask, and if they open them to that awkward angle, do you remember that we saw a couple of times, then you've got the problems with depth of field, right? Anyway, a few examples of that early morning nice sunlight. And as I said, with this sort of creature, this is a female banded demoiselle. I think it suits their sort of appearance quite nicely. It sort of brings out the lovely colours and the metallic quality. This is called a mottled emigrant. This is in India. And again, the early morning light seemed to suit it nicely, sort of gentle light. This is at the other end of the day, back in that lavender field in Cheshire with a painted lady. And I'm shooting towards the sun. I was trying to get the sort of hazy golden feel of the late part of the day. Okay, so what about middle of the day sun? Well, I would generally avoid it because it's pretty harsh light, isn't it? And it's usually something that a lot of photographers avoid because you get strong shadows and contrast. Also, the insects are going to be too active because it's the warmest part of the day, right? So, go home, have your lunch. Okay, so let's move on to composition, and we'll talk a bit more about bokeh, getting a nice background as part of that. Composition is a pretty basic and really important concept in all the visual arts, and it's something that we've probably all heard lots spoken about in talks, etc. So some of what I'll say now will be probably familiar. Some of it I think is subjective, depends on your taste. I'm just going to talk about a fairly simple sort of composition with three main elements: the subject, what I call the perch, the thing it's on, usually a plant, and that background, which for this style is that sort of distant, blurry background. Of course, there are other styles and other sorts of compositions, many other things you can do, as I said, and I'll go through a list of those at the end. But just in terms of this sort of fairly straightforward macro, that sort of thing I tend to do, like this. Let's see what we want. So we've got subject, the perch, and the background. Let's start with the subject. I've already spoken about how to get it sharp and well exposed, right? But let's think about other things, more compositional things. Well, I would say yes, it does need to be in a good position in the frame. Some positions work better than others. Whether that has to be on a third, what we always hear about the thirds, is that's definitely not an absolute rule, I would say. Sometimes it works, but sometimes it doesn't really work. Like that that dragonfly there, we can't really say it's on a third, but it feels right. I guess the plant is on a third. It's what feels right in the frame. Is it filling the frame in a way that feels balanced, or does it feel lopsided and awkward? And that's something you just have to learn to judge, I think. Now, a good size, that to me is probably the most subjective thing of all, because there's such a wide range of styles. You have, from one extreme, the very small subject with lots of sort of empty space or nice bokeh or whatever, up to the other extreme where you have a massive subject with those super close-up lenses magnifying a huge amount. Canon does one that can go up to 5:1 magnification, for example. And that's all about all those beautiful details and being able to see them, and that's fine. So I think all of those work. It's really hard to say, what is the right size. But I think it's easier to say what is a good direction. In other words, is it pointing into space, into the frame, or is it pointing out of the frame? And generally we tend to feel it works better if it has some space that it can move or look into, right? Same with, sort of thing with birds, right? If you take a picture of a bird and its beak is right up to the edge of the frame and there's space behind it, that tends to feel a bit odd, doesn't it? So space to move into, I'd say, yeah, even if it's just a little bit. Now, main details should be clear. Yeah, this is something which can be quite hard to get right, because it requires being just sort of the right angle and there being nothing in the way. But I think it does help to make a better picture if you can see the main parts of the body. And you can think in a more sort of abstract artistic sense of the shape, overall shape it's making in the frame. What pose is it making? Things like diagonals can work quite well, I find. I'll talk more about diagonals later, but you can see both of the plant and the body and also the wings of that dragonfly are all in diagonals, and that I think often works better than horizontals or verticals. But there are certain shapes which work better than others, I would say. Here we have another green vein, sorry, dark green fritillary, and this is the sort of composition I would often use. It is actually on the thirds in this case, but that I did here because the flower at the top was sort of balanced with it in the opposite sort of corner. And it's the sort of size that I like. I like to be able to see some of the details because that's what's interesting to me about macro, partly is the details, but I also want to see more in the frame. I don't just want to see it huge usually. Okay, let's move on to the perch. Now, the perch, the thing that the insect is on, is very often an afterthought and is sort of the downfall of a lot of poorer macro shots. And that's quite understandable because we tend to get focused on the subject itself. You get quite excited. You see the creature, you creep up to it, you're trying to get the shot, you're thinking about that, and you very often don't think about the thing it's on. And yet that is a really important part of the picture. So as well as getting it fairly sharp and well exposed, what else should it be? Well, I think it should be attractive in its own right, in reasonably good condition, just not sort of messy looking, basically. It shouldn't be ugly. Colours are important. The colours should complement the subject and, quite importantly, not dominate it. A lot of wildflowers, for example, are brightly coloured, like yellow, and they can dominate a more dull coloured insect, which then means your eye is drawn away from the insect. Good position or shape in the frame, as with the subject, it's really a combination of the two together. What shape are they making in the frame? Is that working? Is that pleasing? Is it making, focusing attention on the subject? Not too big, yes. So a lot of potential perches that you might see around you if you're out there in the field are likely to be too big or have parts that are too big and may cover the subject, little bits of plants and, little leaves and petals and stuff. So yeah, choose carefully, I would say. And I often find it's more difficult to find a good perch than it is to find the subject, believe it or not. I've experimented with lots of different things and a lot of them don't work. Some of the ones that do, though, I like to use certain kinds of grass. Some that are, work much better than others. This one is called Crested Dog's Tail, and I like that sort of spiral pattern, which is it's attractive, it's subtle. The colours work as well, of course, the green with the red of the insect. This is called Cocksfoot, and you get it in all different sorts of colours. and I think it works quite nicely. It's what I had the 3 marbled whites on that you saw earlier. And I just thought this purple works well with the greens. Orange tip on a bluebell. Bluebells, if you think about it, very often have quite a lot of open flowers, right? So I chose this one because I had just the one, because to me, more than that would have dominated the picture. Okay, let's move on to the background. So probably want it to be blurred, at least for this style, right? Or at least attractive looking. And the word we use for that background blur is bokeh, Japanese word. But what sort of bokeh? Some variation in color or pattern, little, a lot. This, that's probably a matter of taste. But we probably would also agree that we don't want it to be distracting, right? We don't want areas of light and dark, details, shapes, colors, etc., especially lighter areas around the outside. So one of the things I'll often do, as well as making sure it's good in the first place, is in post-processing, if there is a bit too much variation in the background, or especially lighter areas or dark areas even that stand out, I'll use tools like adjustment brushes and so on to reduce those. I'll talk about that later. And the colors, yes, so you want colors that complement the subject and the perch. All the colors should work together, obviously. So a few examples of that. So that's that cocksfoot grass again, and a common blue. And I think this works because of the color harmonies. You can see the color of the grass and the background, which is the same grass, sort of echoed in the wing, right? Which means the other colors in the butterfly stand out more. This is a hairy shield bug. To me, it's just a fascinating creature with amazing detail on it. The stripes, the spots, the shapes, the colors, the hairs, everything is amazing. And so because there was so much going on with that, I thought that a background that was fairly plain would be better, and also a color that sort of complemented those other colors, the yellows and the reds. A couple of ringlets, again on that cocksfoot. In this case, I think it was better to have a very different color in the background. If I'd had the sort of yellowy, beigey, browny colors that in the foreground, also in the background, it just becomes a general sort of muddiness. Orange tips on one of their favorite flowers, the cuckoo flower. The fairly plain background, that's actually my lawn. A 4-spotted chaser. Now the background there is the pond that it was hunting around, and I quite like the variations in color and the suggestion that, of where it actually was, its habitat. This is the sort of bokeh where you have sun hitting drops of rain, and you're shooting towards the sun and you get these nice blobs. Another banded demoiselle male. There's a bit more variation in color than I would normally have in the background here, but I quite like the yellows of the buttercups in this case because of how they set off the bluey greens of the insect. So obviously there are many other different styles, types of compositions, lots of things you can do to get different sorts of shots, and I've listed various different ones here. You've already seen some of my shots with more than one insect, and I'm going to show you some more in a moment, but I certainly recommend experimenting, trying different things. Even multiple exposure and long exposure can create interesting effects. You wouldn't put a shot like that into a nature category in a salon, for example, but so what, you can create beautiful pictures with all sorts of different approaches. I'll show you a few more examples of where I've done more than one insect. So here we have 2 commas, 2 emerald damselflies, and a stalk of horsetail, a large red and an azure damselfly, and here I was interested in the 3 colours, the red, blue and green, which worked well, I thought. 2 dark green fritillaries, 2 painted ladies, 2 more common blues. I need to darken that picture a little bit. 2 orange tips on bluebell. You can see I chose that bluebell because it had the 2 flowers open, pointing in the right direction, so I could position them. Also, I chose that angle. You see that they're on a slope. I've experimented with different angles with some of these sorts of shots, and if it's horizontal, didn't seem to work as well, and if it's more tilted than this, it didn't seem to work as well. We'll come back to this one when we do post-processing. This one, by the way, this is one of the ones that got a gold medal at the Southport Salon. Two painted ladies back in that lavender field, and the 3 green veined whites, which got the gold medal at Basingstoke. With this one, I actually changed the colour of the flower because the bluebells were very deep, intense blue, and they were dominating the picture really. And so I desaturated them a little bit, and also changed the colour to more of a purple because that's complemented the yellows of the insects more, I thought. I think I also increased the yellow of some of them, so just to make the 3 of them slightly closer in colour. And then the 3 marbled whites, which got a gold at some other salon last year, I think. Okay, let's go on to post-processing. So I use Lightroom and Photoshop, and as of this week, Topaz Denoise. So, you know, as I've been saying, I'm trying to create a pictorial look, sort of painterly, beautiful look. So that means I don't want too much variation in the background. I want to see the details in the you know, in the body of the insects and the plants. So I'll adjust levels, maybe reduce highlights and shadows, things like that. Color I may adjust a little bit. Very often the raw image is a bit flat and dull, so I'll increase the vibrance to saturation, or maybe change hues like I said I did with those bluebells. Adjustment brushes can be useful for various things such as highlights and shadows in the background. Right, now noise reduction, I'm actually going to have to take that out because I've decided now to switch from Lightroom to Topaz Denoise, so I'll do that separately. Let's look at this example here, the 2 orange tips and the bluebell. So this is one of the raw images. I'm always shooting in raw, and it's not very sharp because it's just one of several that I used to you know, focus stack, and the colors are a bit dull really, aren't they? So here's what I did in Lightroom. A little bit brighter, slightly more contrast, and as you can see, I've lowered the highlights a bit and raised the shadows a bit to bring out more detail. The presence tools can be useful if used carefully. Texture, clarity, bring out a bit more detail, just don't do it too much. And then one of the main things I did in this picture actually was adjust the color of the flowers because I thought they were just too pale. So I increased the saturation and decreased the luminance, you know, darken them a little bit to make them a bit richer. So then I'll look at the pictures again in Photoshop, and I find it's really important to check again the overall look, you know, the general levels and color, because very often I find my bias is that the picture that comes out of Lightroom doesn't have quite enough impact. I do struggle a bit with with judging color and contrast. That's my main weakness, I think, as a photographer. So, you know, I'll make a few further tweaks, fix some defects, possibly with spot healing or clone. And then I'll do some sharpening with Unsharp Mask, although actually Topaz does that. Part of the Denoise program, it does sharpening. And in fact, there is a Topaz sharpening bit of software as well you can get, which is meant to be good. This is Unsharp Mask. I like Unsharp Mask in Photoshop because of its flexibility. There it is in Filter, Sharpen, Unsharp Mask at the bottom there. It's got these 3 sliders, you see, so you can change the amounts. I usually have it around here for this sort of subject. Threshold needs to be low, 5 to 7, but it's the radius which I'll then vary. I'll bring it right down to the bottom and then just sort of gradually increase it, go up and down until I find that, you know, the perfect spot. Obviously you have to be careful how much you sharpen, you can overdo it. You can see in I'm going to show you the next window has got, the next picture's got the radius raised up to 1.2. You might be able to see it in this window here. You may also be able to see it in the picture itself here, especially around the middle. So here it is. So you can see now it says 1.2 there, and hopefully you can see it's sharper up there, but I don't know if it comes through on Zoom, but if I go back, around the middle there, it's not as sharp as it was to me. I'm going to go back there to 1.2. To me, that just looks better, a little bit more detailed and crisp, more beautiful. And then a final crop. And that is basically it, unless I'm doing focus stacking, of course. So if I'm doing focus stacking, then I'll do that first to the pictures that come out of Lightroom, and then all the other things 1 to 4 there on the final image. So that takes us from this raw image here to the final, much more vibrant, crisp, and detailed shot. Okay, so that's it. That's the website, artofmacro.com. You can see more of my pictures there. I'm just going to mention my other talks briefly. As I mentioned, I'm doing one on my plants and fungi shots called Flora, creating that at the moment. I have 2 on my landscapes covering different subjects, as you can see there. And I have a science talk on the eye, actually how the eye works and how the brain perceives things we see, and how seeing evolved. So we shall stop there.
Right, well, thank you ever so much, Tony. That's I've seen your talk before, but I was still enthralled. There's a few changes I noticed, Topaz being one of them, but no, that was really good. I'm assuming you're open for a few questions, just if the members would like to unmute themselves, and of course our guests, feel free to ask Tony some questions. I'm sure he'll be happy to answer them for you. I'll have a look at my list, see what I said. Yeah, that's the. I think you answered one of the my question that I wrote down there. That and I actually put 90%, but I'll change it to 75%. But it's fair to say that I suppose 75% of your photography, be it butterflies and damselflies, is morning and evening. I suppose when they're all sort of dormant. Is that true to say? Or
more morning. I mean, some people will go in the evening, but I've often found that they just sort of about 6 o'clock they'll vanish. They become really hard to find. But that, that would depend on the species and the location, I think.
I see. Yeah. Any other questions from other guests or?
Tony, you said I think you use an LED light sometimes to put a bit of fill-in light in the mornings. Do you use that for the mornings, or is that just your fungi you use?
No, I don't use that with insects. I just use it. I use it with various things, like in the studio for various things like that. But I do use it with fungi. Yeah, it seems to work okay with fungi. There's something about fungi, maybe just because of their sort of mysterious nature and being in these sort of wooded environments, that lighting them in a slightly more artificial way just seems to work okay for some reason.
Yeah, it looks really nice with that backlit and from below. Yeah. Do you do fungi all year, or do you just mainly stick?
No. Generally, once the insect season is slowing down, sort of September, then I'm starting to think about fungi, and then in October, I'm going really hard for it, and then even in November and even December, there's still some around.